Hello class, this is Professor Joseph Holbrook. We're going to continue with part 2 of chapter 12, Between Revolutions, which deals with some of the political developments between the Mexican Revolution ending in 1920 and the beginning of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And so we're talking about dictators and populists, particularly in Argentina. Various forms of populism failed. Mexico experienced the most far-reaching reforms in the longest era without upheaval. Argentina, however, became the setting for the most notorious populist regime in the Americas. Juan Domingo Perón and his wife Eva Duarte de Perón emerged from a series of political crises to become the dominant couple in Argentina. The Peróns managed to capture the imagination of the poor and the working class. The working class was called the shirtless ones, or the decamisados, to emphasize some of the poverty of the poor or working class. Perón was ousted in 1955, and Evita died of cancer in 1953, but they maintained influence until he maintained influence until his death in 1974 and beyond. This is a picture of a synagogue in Buenos Aires, a Jewish synagogue. In Guatemala, there was a brutal dictator named Jorge Ubico from 1931 to 1944. A group of students led a revolution in 1944, which led to Ubico's resignation. Professor Juan José Arevalo was elected by 85% of the vote after Ubico was removed. He was followed up by another democratically elected reformer, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was friends with several communists, but was not himself a communist, although he was a reformer and was attempting to develop large-scale land reform. Sadly, in 1954, the United States intervened in Guatemalan internal affairs and helped organize a coup that removed him through the CIA. Che Guevara happened to be in Guatemala City at the time as a young student, and he drew the lesson from the Guatemalan overthrow, the CIA engineered coup that Cuba would have to go radical or not at all, and which is the advice he gave Fidel Castro later, because he saw that a moderate reforming program would not be allowed by the United States. This is Jacobo Arbenz, who was removed from power by the CIA. The major populist experiments failed in the long term in Latin America during this period. The only successful reforms were tied to export economies. The American Popular Revolutionary Alliance, APRA, in Peru was the most auspicious failure under Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre. Aya believed that socialism was not possible in Peru, but he was anti-imperialist and anti-American. Nevertheless, he provoked opposition from the upper class. The most successful social reforms took place in Bolivia under the National Revolutionary Movement, the MNR. In 1951, MNR's Victor Paz Estenssoro took power with a popular uprising against the military. The new Bolivian revolutionary government carried out extensive land reform, implemented universal suffrage. The Indians for the first time had access to land and politics. They destroyed the traditional landowning class, nationalized the tin mines, enfranchised all males and females in the vote, and they virtually eliminated the military. The MNR remained in power until 1964, which makes one wonder why in the world Che Guevara chose Bolivia as his target for exporting revolution in around the same year, 1964. What made him think that Bolivians would be receptive? This is Victor Paz Estenssoro as an older man. Women's suffrage was also an important issue during this time. It kind of accompanied industrialization and urbanization. There was the first wave of feminists in which women in Latin America were comfortable with defining themselves as mothers and wives. They used their status as mothers and wives to further their participation in the public sphere. One example was the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, the mothers of the Plaza of May, were women who began to protest the disappearance of their children and grandchildren during the dirty war in Argentina. And over time, they brought tremendous pressure to bear on the Argentine government to acknowledge its crimes. Acción Femenina. This is a period in which women become empowered. In conclusion, for Chapter 12, the import substitution economics and populist politics dominated the era of 1920 to 1959. Import substitution was intended to protect Latin America from competition, but it did not stabilize economic conditions. Most countries were too poor to buy their own products, or they lacked capital to develop it. Foreign investment was unavailable. The social question mostly tended to populism and cross-class alliances. Charismatic leaders such as Irigoyen and Perón in Argentina enabled years of social peace, relying on booming exports to pay for support. Nevertheless, ordinary Latin Americans struggled during this period. The failure of economic policies and politics to lead to development intensified social tensions under the shadow of the Cold War. Now I'm going to insert a parenthesis here and talk for a few minutes about some of the theories of revolution before we go on to the next chapter 13. Let me back up for a moment. Bear with me, please, for just a second. In the next few chapters, we'll be talking quite a bit about some of the contemporary revolutions in Latin America, so I just want to give a little theoretical background. Numerous theories have been advanced, and many studies of revolutions have been carried out over the last years. 2,500 years ago, Aristotle described two types of political revolution: the complete change from one constitution to another, or the modification of an existing constitution, according to Aristotle. The word revolution was first used to describe the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when King James II, who was Catholic, was removed and replaced on the throne of England by William III, William of Orange, who was Dutch and was Protestant. In the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French political scientist, distinguished between types of political revolution, such as a sudden and violent revolution that seeks to change society and culture rapidly, or a slow sweeping transformation that takes several generations to carry out, for example, the Industrial Revolution. Distinctions can also be made between political revolutions, economic revolutions, and social revolutions. Sometimes a revolution may have all three aspects. But the American Revolution, for example, the 13 colonies that rebelled against Great Britain, was entirely political. There was very little social or economic content to it. While the French Revolution had tremendous social implications and some economic implications. You might also think of the Haitian Revolution, which certainly had social and economic implications as well as political. Charles Tilly, a modern scholar of revolution, differentiates between different kinds of revolution, such as a coup, a top-down seizure of power, a civil war, a revolt, and a great revolution. Great revolutions he defines as revolutions that transform economic and social structures, as well as political institutions, such as the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917, or the Islamic Revolution of Iran in 1979. There's three kinds of theories about why revolutions happen. One is psychological, then there's a sociological and a political theories. The psychological, to oversimplify a little, psychological focuses on the widespread frustration of the populace with the status quo, which causes a revolt. In the Haitian Revolution, for example, the African population, the slave population, was at its breaking point with the brutality and mistreatment of their owners, and all it took was the catalyst of the French Revolution to open Pandora's box. Sociological would indicate that there must be a severe imbalance in society, or some kind of a lack of equilibrium to spark a revolt. In the political theories, revolutions are seen as a result of a power struggle by competing interest groups. A well-known scholar of revolutions is Theda Skocpol. She wrote States and Social Revolutions in the 1990s, late 1980s. She gives a definition: a revolution is a rapid basic transformation of society's state and class structures, accompanied and in part carried through by class-based revolts from below. There's a picture of her book. It's a classic in political theory. Timothy Wickham Crowley wrote a more recent study of revolutions in the early 90s in Latin America, and he focused almost exclusively on Latin America and revolutions in Latin America in the second half of the 20th century. He does an extensive survey and finds that there are 3 or 4 necessary conditions. The opposition must be supported by a multi-class coalition, not just workers or just the poor and peasants, but probably also including middle class and professionals. This was the case in both Cuba and Nicaragua, which are the 2 important examples of successful revolutions. There was a multi-class coalition: workers, peasants, and also middle-class revolutionaries, students, intellectuals. The second one is to carry out a successful revolution, the regime must be discredited. A mafiocracy, for example, also known as a Praetorian regime. This equals corruption. The people must view the regime as so corrupt and so self-serving that it loses all credibility with the military as well as with the people in general. And this again happened in both Cuba and Nicaragua. Before the Nicaraguan Revolution, there had been an earthquake in Managua, and Somoza had pocketed a large amount of the relief funds that were given to help the earthquake victims, and of course this was seen as absolute corruption by the people of Nicaragua. And he lost all credibility, even with his own National Guard. The regime must be cut off from outside or international military assistance. In both cases, in Cuba and Nicaragua, the United States suspended support for Batista, military support, in late 1959, as a result of some of the brutality and corruption of the Batista regime. Also, the United States was not aware of the extent to which Fidel Castro was committed to a communist path. They saw him as a nationalist freedom fighter, and so they were willing to suspend support for Batista in order to give an advantage to Castro, and this led to the successful Cuban Revolution. Also in Nicaragua, Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, and he had a strong emphasis on civil rights, human rights, and because of the human rights abuses of the Somoza regime, he suspended military assistance to the Nicaraguan National Guard, which enabled the Sandinistas to carry out a successful revolution. Some other examples: in Colombia, Guatemala, Argentina, El Salvador, this did not happen. In El Salvador, for example, President Reagan continued to increase military support over a 10-year period. The insurgency in El Salvador came very close to victory, but they were never quite able to succeed because of the external military support of the United States. This was also true in Guatemala and Colombia. There was a large amount of strategic assistance from the United States. Also in Colombia, you had a rather stable democracy excuse me, even